welcome Jeff Wilson. Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you.
Looks like you've got quite a story to tell us.
I'm going to try, yeah. Quite a few items we pulled out of the attic to try to tell the story and keep me aligned on timelines and things like that. So first, good afternoon. A quick introduction. My name is Jeff Wilson, like you said. My wife Caroline and I have been lifelong residents of Orange and are privileged to raise our family here as well. I have two sons, Benjamin, age 15, and Morgan, age 14. Our family currently operates Treat Farm in the southern part of Orange. And like many farms in Orange, our farm has been passed down for many, many generations. Over hundreds of years. Really proud about our past, and you'll see that in some of the pictures. Really interested in history and passing that down to educate new generations, and I'm glad my ancestors did that with us as well, so we have a perspective on what happened in town and surrounding area. Today I'll primarily focus on the Treat family, as they were one of the early settlers in the area in Orange and have maintained the presence over the years. So if you hear me talking about it, it's pretty much focused on Treat family history. Present in this country for at least 14 generations and closing in on 400 years total. So first of all, how did we get here? I know that's one of the questions people ask. How did we get to Orange? And it was a long ride over many, many years. They immigrated here. Richard and Alice Treat immigrated here in 1930, I believe it was, or maybe possibly in the early 1930s, 1630, I'm sorry, from a small village called Pitminster, England, which is in the southwestern part of England. What's interesting is the town, the village, and the church that they belong to is still in existence. In fact, my mother and sisters visited there many years ago. And it's kind of neat that the church that they grew up with, and actually many of the people were baptized in, is still there, some of the gravestones. So that's where they were all from. They landed in Massachusetts in the early 1930s and then immigrated down into Connecticut. I think it was 1637 into Wethersfield. From there, okay, how did we get down to this area from Wethersfield, you might be asking. Robert Treat, who was the son of Richard and Alice, who was very young at the time, came down from Wethersfield to Milford. And that was 1639. He was one of the first settlers in Milford. And it was interesting, as I was doing some research, I always wondered why isn't his name on the list of the free planters, I think, that settled the town of Milford. And I never knew why, because he was there. And what I found out, and this was kind of interesting, he was so young. I think he was either between 14 and 16 years old. And he came on his own from Wethersfield down to the Milford area. And because he was so young, he was not initially included on any of the lists. However, he was there. Now, couple things. Robert Treat was an interesting guy, and I'll try to move kind of quickly through this, but very interesting guy. At a very young age, did quite a bit. Settled land disputes, surveyed land, did a lot for the city of Milford. And was heavily respected because of that. He headed the militia for the colony at one point, and then became the 23rd governor of the state of the colony of Connecticut, which was kind of interesting. And then, as you probably know, he was allegedly involved in hiding the charter and the charter oak tree way back from when. So, kind of an interesting character. And that was one of our first ancestors that landed in the area of Milford. And so our history, as you know, is tied very much to the city of Milford. In fact, being called North Milford for many, many years. And so a lot of the history that I found and that researched is tied in with Milford. the Treats lived and worked around Milford, Orange area, and it was difficult for me to pinpoint the exact date that they started in Orange, farming or settling in Orange. My guess is it might have been around 1690 potentially, when Captain Joseph Treat, one of the sons, married Frances Bryan, and Bryan's a very old name in town. My guess is around that time. They may have already been here in North Milford, but around that time they probably came up in this way. So that's a little bit about how we got into the town of Orange and really have stayed since then. Now, what are some of the things that the Treats have done in town, and wide variety over that amount of time, 300 plus years, right? They obviously were settlers, as we talked about, farming. Big farmers, it's pretty much what everybody did at that point, and the Treat family definitely actively participated in farming. Surveyors, I may have mentioned that, so they were big in surveying. In fact, did a lot of the land mapping for the King of England prior to the Revolutionary War, as you would expect. So, and that's how the Treats acquired land and farming. They would survey, and instead of taking payment, they would take payment in land. And one of the interesting things, because we were trying to find a little bit more about Treat Farm, the first Treat Farm was started in 1637, not in Orange, but in what's now the town of Glastonbury. So for surveying, Richard Treat was gifted 900 acres in the eastern part of the river from Wethersfield, and that was the first mention I've seen of Treat Farm, was in 1637 in that area, and then we just continued that. So other occupations that Treats have had through the years: craftsmen, carpentry, other things like that, bankers, financial management, things like that, and then the military as well. So Samuel Treat, father and son, both called Samuel Treat, fought in the Revolutionary War. That's the closest tied to us here. And then a couple other Treat family, Smith family members that were in the Civil War as well. So there were some military people. Even beyond that, the militia prior to the Revolutionary War, the militia for Connecticut, sort of defending land and space in Connecticut. What contributions has the family made to the town, and what was important for the Treat family? Many members of the family have served in local government here in Orange, whether as selectmen, first selectmen, and beyond that, many Treats have served on commissions and associations within town. A lot of that surrounds agriculture, because that was just such a big driver in the day. The one I remember is the Cemetery Association, and I'm going to get into a little bit more modern day. My memory surrounds my grandparents, Addie and Charlie Treat, who were born in the late 1800s. So a lot of my memories are listening to stories of them, experiences they have, but heavily involved in the Cemetery Association. And at the time when I was a kid, I didn't really understand what that was all about and why it was so important. But history, like I mentioned before, history was very important to the family, and passing that down, understanding it, what the lineage was, what it meant, was very important. And being part of the Cemetery Association was a duty for them to help preserve that. The Orange Fair was also a very big deal. For me and our generation, it was huge. For my parents, it was huge. But what's funny, and I have my visual aids here that I will reference, the original Orange Fair, they were very involved with being on the board of directors. And I think they really just liked showing off their agricultural heritage, what they did, what they raised, how they did things. It's interesting, you could see in the photographs just how much pride they took in, and also how many people were there participating actively. So it was great to look through pictures of the original fair.
Jeff, when was the date on those? Those
Yeah.
were back in the early 1900s.
This was the early 1900s, so 1911 was when this was dated. So you're more than 100 years ago. Clifford Treat, my great-grandfather, was one of the board members of the original fair. And I remember my parents helping out when they kind of relaunched it. I think it was 1976, right? When they
72.
70. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I got my dates messed up.
Then a couple of years after that, it really took off. But
Right.
that's when it started.
Yeah. So that was one of my fond memories as a child, was participating in the fair, and it was great to see how the community pulled together to really launch that event, that celebration, but then also the fair was such a big deal. I remember how hard the fair committee worked to make the event meaningful and fun for everybody, and it really was. I also remember, and Judy, you remember this as well, I'm sure, the residents and fair committee getting together and clearing the land.
Yes.
And now we take it all for granted. We walk around it, we see it, the carnival is there, but that was wooded, and they voluntary cleared that and made it the space that it is today and the fair that it is today. So the agricultural fair has always been a big deal for our family, whether it be the modern day one or the original one that was in town. So like I mentioned, I was born in 1971. My exposure to history was primarily through my grandparents. And I'm in awe of what they experienced within their lifetime. And it amazes me when I think back of what they experienced and the advances that they saw and how they had to change, right? They had to be very resilient, self-sufficient, and they had a great sense of community to make it work. They grew up fast. I have pictures in here of my grandfather and his brother, and they were hunting rabbits at age, it looks like they were 3 and 4 years old. So they were responsible at very early ages to do many tasks, to do different things. So they did grow up very fast. The other thing I did want to talk about, and it holds true today, education was very important in the town and the family as well. And Orange is great for that. We're known for our education system now. They were known for their education system back then as well. But it was a little bit different than that. My grandfather went to the academy in town through, I believe, 8th grade it was. And after that, they went to New Haven, which is hard to wrap my mind around in the early 1900s. As a child, as a 9th grader, going into New Haven for grammar school. And so we have a grammar school diploma here from 1909. Other thing, so after they finished that, they would then go to high school, and it was the New Haven High School. This is a picture from 1914 of the class that he would have been in.
So it was actually called New Haven High School.
It was called New Haven High School. Correct. Yeah.
And we talked about those are children at that point, we want to call them in high school, from all over the area.
Correct. Yeah. So there was no Amity, there was no
Hill House.
Orange, yeah, no Hill House. So they were all going to New Haven. So quite a big class when you consider the population of the area in the early 1900s. So pretty interesting. But they took education very seriously. The other thing that always, I can't say it surprised me, that I'll say I found very interesting is what they taught in high school back then. They were very advanced. I have drawings that my grandfather did in high school, drafting drawings, that I didn't do in engineering school until probably my sophomore year, and they were doing this in high school. They also did quite a bit with accounting, bookkeeping and things like that. That was important for them to learn. But they were well educated for the time and learned quite a bit in high school. What we did find out also is they kept meticulous records on anything and everything. So we have probably hundreds of books where they tracked every spend that they had, every cow, how much milk each day, how much butter fat, and anything and everything was tracked. And they were meticulous on this. So there were no computers, obviously, but they kept track of it, everything, which is helpful when you go back and look at history. One really neat example that I found about a year ago is, it wasn't a diary, but they were logging hours. And back then, there was a lot of labor that was involved with the farm. Equipment wasn't very prevalent, so it was a lot of hard, backbreaking labor. And they would write down how many hours each farmhand put, what they were working on, what the weather was that day. Everything was logged down. So it was pretty interesting. And I have to believe that they learned that in school, how to do that and the importance of that. So the other thing I think of is the commute into New Haven. And my mother's generation did it as well. I believe she went to Hill House High School prior to Amity. She did graduate from Amity, but many kids in the Orange area went to high school in New Haven as well. So what else can I tell you about? Okay, that generation, accessibility, and I think about what they had at the time and what they experienced. So when that generation was born, again, late 1800s, it was horses, really getting them, trolleys as well, and railroad. But for the most part, they were on horses getting places. And Orange was an agricultural town. It was farms, and that was, I can't say that was it, but it was very agricultural based at that point. And so they were had to be very reliant, because they could not get to stores very easily. And so they tried to do whatever they could on the farm to make things work. They saw that change quite a bit over the years, right? They started with horses, trolleys, and things like that. And my grandparents, again, started with horses, went to cars, and saw the space shuttle launch. So I think about what they experienced over their time frame. It was pretty neat. You know, the other part, communication, started out with mail, and they saw the inventions and use of cell phones. And so just communication became, so when you kind of put that all together, you know, it's pretty admirable what they went through at the time. Now, what my grandparents did for a living, they were farmers, and they ran a dairy farm in the town of Orange, again, the southern part of Orange. And they milked many cows, at least 2, possibly 3 barns of cows each day. It was tiring, backbreaking work, and I can tell that from the records that were kept, what they did. 2 times a day they were milking cows. You never could stop. And then the work in the field in between was, again, backbreaking. Limited equipment. They were doing a lot by hand. They were doing a lot with oxen. And so you see the oxen as our town seal, but you know, that's some of the real thing right there. They were utilized quite a bit. Oxen and horses were your equipment in the day, right? So they worked very hard in what they did. Now, they did take a break on Sundays, from my understanding. Sunday was church, and Sunday afternoons they would have somebody help milking the cows for them, and that was time for family, to my understanding, and community. But with family, they would visit family. Family would come and visit them. They would do things like crabbing. But for the most part, I think they were just kind of hanging out and enjoying each other's company and enjoying the break that they had for that half a day a week. So it was pretty intense what they were doing. And I think I mentioned this before, but a lot of labor was involved in required to run the farm. Between 8 to 12 men, from what I could understand, at any given time. And some of the things, again, we take for granted that they had to deal with. There was no refrigeration back in the day. And so one of the things that they had to do was cut harvest ice, and then store ice. And you don't think about it much these days, right? You have refrigerators and things like that. But we had ponds that would flood, and when it got cold enough, they went out there with ice plows and saws and cut ice and then stored it in the ice house for the milk. Again, it's another example of extra things that they had to do that we don't have to deal with now. From that generation, a couple of what I call influential events that I think drove them and molded them. One was the Depression, and you probably heard a lot about that. But resources were very scarce again, and they had to make do with what they had. And things weren't as accessible. And so they saved everything. Every scrap of wood, every piece of hardware was saved, and a use was found. Nothing went to waste with that generation. The other thing that they did, and this is kind of comical, I don't know how they did it, but they like to move buildings, and we don't even consider this anymore. But in going through, and I knew some of this, right? As we go through, I know what we consider our garage right now used to be a carriage house, and it was 300 yards from where it is now, and they would pick it up and move it. I wouldn't even attempt that right now with equipment, and they did it back in the day with horses somehow. But if you look at some of the pictures, old pictures that we have, you don't remember buildings being inserted, and they would pick them up and move them around down the street. They would repurpose things. So what we know as the horse barn now was a chicken coop generation before. And our main dairy barn that we utilize now, I look at it, it looks all uniform. The state did a study a few years ago, and they said that was 3 different barns put together to make one barn. So they reused everything, and like I said, nothing went to waste. They cobbled things together and just made do with things. And so the other big, so Depression kind of drove a lot of that resourcefulness that they had. The other big event I'll lump them together, but the World Wars. And what that meant to farming around here is that labor that was required to do the work wasn't available anymore. They were either involved in the war effort or they were in the war itself. And so those 8 to 12 people that you were reliant on didn't exist. And what they utilized, and I remember my grandfather talking quite a bit about this, they would employ prisoners in a chain gang to help at the farm, which made them extremely nervous that you have this chain gang now all of a sudden show up at your farm, but that was the only labor that was available. And my grandfather, again, he told us how nervous he was in utilizing that labor, but how respectful the prisoners were and how much work they did. So at the end of the day, it worked out very well, and he respected those people that helped him out during that time. So that was a big deal to kind of get through the world wars as a farmer. Okay, so that's sort of my grandparents' generation. My generation, I'll kind of skip one. What do I remember in town? I mentioned the fair as being a big influential event, and huge appreciation for the fair committee and everybody that was involved with putting on that event. I remember space in the town of Orange, and it feels, I think we've developed the right way, but when I was a child, there were empty lots on the post road still. There wasn't as much development as there is today. I think we've grown appropriately, but it's just a busier area than it was when I was a kid. So in my generation, I've seen it grow immensely. Education, I mentioned in my grandparents' generation, that was also, and I think it remains today, very important to the town of Orange, and the dedication to the education system is still remains huge, and that's very much appreciated. That's part of why we stayed in the town of Orange, and we raise our family here. Other things that I remember, so again, I am kind of engrossed with agriculture as well. I have worked on Grassy Hill Farm as a child. I remember those days, Judy, working on your farm for many years, for when I was in high school and then through college as well. And I cherished that time. I learned quite a bit working for Joey Moncheski and around town. The other thing that sticks out in my head is the sense of community that we have in the town of Orange. And I experienced this, again, my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, and mine. Everybody is always there to help each other out. When my grandparents were older, I remember the Besputa and the Hine families jumping in to help. Whatever it took, the families would support each other. And I would imagine that holds true since Orange was founded. And I still see that today. In a little bit different way. You're not helping put hay in the barn or anything like that, but the sense of community when somebody needs a hand is still there and still important in town. So that's something I experienced that I think has been consistent through the history.
Even if you need a tractor part or something.
If I need a tractor part, you can borrow it. Yeah, it still happens today. And we still, yeah, it's a great example. You need a hand. Now it's a little bit easier. You can make a cell phone call to get that help. But somebody is always there. Yeah, in the farming realm, I can always call somebody up if I'm in a pinch, and somebody will be there to help you out, whether it's loaning equipment or just helping you get something done. Yeah. It still exists. And that's one of the things I'm proud about of the town.
Anything else you can think of?
All
right, well, let's go in the future. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Obviously, your legacy is very long and deep in Orange, and something to be very proud of.
Yeah.
You've got 2 boys.
Yes.
Is your hope that one of them at least would carry on? Do you see one having interest in it?
I think it's, I think it's always our hope. Yeah. I was not driven to agriculture by my grandparents or parents. It was never pushed on us. We definitely had chores and we had to help out on the farm, but it was never said to us, this is going to be your occupation. And so I enjoyed it so much. I don't do farming full time. I do it as a hobby, and it's a hobby that has grown over the years, probably to a full-time level. And my approach would be very much the same with my kids. I want them to continue with their education, do what they want to do, and if it's something that draws them back, that's great. If it doesn't, that's great as well. They help out quite a bit. They seem to enjoy it, but I won't push it too far with them. But something, actually, I'll go back in time again. It's a little bit interesting, and things have changed a little bit. Again, my grandfather's generation, he had a brother and sister. And now, when you think of a farm or property or anything like that, it's typically evenly divided up between children. And that was not the case back then. And there's pluses and minuses to that. So from my knowledge, my grandfather wanted to be a surveyor. He loved history. He knew that his ancestors were surveyors. He loved engineering. He loved that part of school. And you could tell from the work that he did, he really liked it. And he wanted to be a surveyor and continue his education. But as the oldest son, the farm is yours and you are the farmer. And I can't say he resented that. He might have been a little bit unhappy at first with that, but over the years he really learned to love it. And I think he's kind of happy. I think he was happy that he was sort of pushed in that direction, if you will. But if you were the second son or a daughter, yeah, you're out. And so it was a little bit different back then on how they did things.
Which does make it difficult, because if you are not the one that's really into it,
Correct.
you're forced into it.
You're
so to
forced,
speak.
right.
Yeah.
And you could have been the second child who was into it, but it was just an expectation, and things were different back then and how they transferred. But they had whole parcels and whole farms that continued instead of splitting up over time.
That's true. That's true. And I think that was important,
Right.
to keep them
Yeah.
going.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other silly stories you remember growing up in town?
Let's see, silly stories.
Because you got to admit, back in your time, and even a few years, there were a lot of things that we had a lot of fun with, being on a farm,
Yes.
and they're very unique sometimes.
I mostly got in the way, because I was probably the youngest, not the youngest. My sister would have been the youngest, but I was the second youngest out of all the grandchildren. And I remember cutting and baling hay was a big deal. And that's what we did. Growing up at our farm, the dairy cows had been sold by that point, and so primarily the whole farm was just hay, and that's what my grandparents did. And so my cousins were a bit older, and they were more productive than I was, and I was young enough to drive the truck. I think at 8 years old or even younger, they would kind of set me up, get the truck rolling, and I had to steer. But I pretty much got in the way when I was a young kid. Other things that I remember, gardening was a huge deal. So if it wasn't the commercial and farming, my grandmother had probably a 1-acre garden, and I think she fed everybody in the town. You would have sworn she would have, but everybody came over, and it was constant, hey, take this, take this, take this. And harvesting and preserving food was a big deal. And I remember as a kid doing a lot of that, beans, corn, everything. And that ties back to having to be self-reliant. They knew what they had to do, and it was different. There were no Home Depots, there were no ShopRites at the time when they grew up. So they knew how to preserve, they knew how to do things. And like many generations of farmers, you were a jack of all trades. You had to know, you had to be part veterinarian, part chemist, part mechanic to get everything done. And you had to understand just about everything to get that done. We, of course, got into trouble like everybody else did, and did silly stuff on the farm, and nothing that got anybody very hurt. They're very hurt to where they didn't heal.
But it was a good way to grow up.
It was very fun, yeah. So I will say Orange was and still is a great place. There's enough space to get into trouble and have fun, but everything is accessible to us this day, which is great. And I talked to new residents of Orange that have moved in, and they like that balance, the balance of being out in the country to some extent, right? Residential area where we have space. They like the education, and they like the accessibility when you think about it. You're 5 minutes away from shopping and getting what you need, but you're still somewhat out in the country. And I think people also like the historical element of the town and the events that we have. So it's a great place to grow up. My kids love growing up here, and so.
That's awesome.
Do you have any people that you remember from growing up maybe not necessarily family, but people that were also involved in the town, and maybe some people that we may have interviewed. Any memories?
You mentioned Vespudas and stuff.
Yes, I will possibly incriminate some people here, but no, in a positive way. Mr. Vespuda is one that comes to mind, and I was telling Judy the story earlier. He was my bus driver when I was in elementary school, and we were his first stop, and I remember each day, I think he would purposely get to the bus stop early. My grandmother would wait with us at the bus stop, and he would get there, it felt like 5 minutes early, and they would just jabber back and forth and give each other a hard time about this and that. And it was a lot of fun. And so he was one of the ones that, I always had fond memories of. And then again, with his involvement with the fair and just historical agriculture in the area, always had a lot of respect for Mr. Vespuda and his family. So he's one that stands out. Obviously, teachers in the town of Orange that I remember were just outstanding. Everybody was just so interested in every child, including me, and making sure that they had what they needed and they advanced within the school system. And I know that still exists to this day, but that's one of the memories that I have. It's just how dedicated they were to their job and to the children in the town is another one. I remember some of the first selectmen throughout the years. The one that I remember as a child was Ralph Capicilatro, who seemed like he was always in charge in the town of Orange. And then, of course, Dottie Berger, Brendan Toohey was another one that I remember growing up. The other person, also big family agriculture, is Walter Hine. I understand you're going to interview him hopefully shortly. He was always very tied into our family. Obviously, the Hine history, Fieldview Farm in the town is remarkable what the family has done over the years. But they always helped the Treats and related way back. The families are related way back, but always helping each other out to some extent. And then, of course, the Wright family as well. And I have some pictures in here of taking silos down that Tommy Wright Sr. was involved with. So a lot of history there as well.
Anything other questions? You good?
Yeah, keep prompting me. I got more, but I just got to think of other stuff.
I just think it's really awesome, like how your interest in agriculture kind of just stemmed from your experience of it as a child, and it wasn't even really pushed on you to continue that. It was just from your love for it, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, I think if it was pushed, I might not have liked it as much. I kind of went into it voluntarily. And again, it was kind of weird. I mentioned before working on Grassy Hill Farm with Joey Moncheski, and Stanley Skalski was another gentleman in town who was a great farmer. And so working from them, I had a blast. It was fun. We did some stuff that, it was hard work, but we enjoyed doing it. So summers were constantly on a tractor picking corn and just loved being outside. And we had a good time doing that. And again, the town felt smaller back then too, a little bit. And I don't mean that in a negative way towards today at all, but I remember police officers stopping by the field, checking in. You knew everybody's name because it was smaller back then, and it was maybe a little bit closer knit because the numbers were less. And so that was always a kind of a neat thing. Good and bad, right? Good in that you could always, you kind of knew everybody, but bad if you ever did anything wrong, everybody knew about it, and they knew who you were too. So. And
they would report back to your
parents. That's right.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. So you always had that fear that oh my God, this is somebody my parents know. It's Mr. Miller, he's gonna tell on me and get it back to my parents, and you were in trouble.
That's it. Oh my goodness. I think we had the same type of threat. My dad said, I better never see your name in the paper. And of course, that was at the time at school that they started putting in who's got first honors, second honors. So we were kind of like stuck in the middle. So should we go for these honor things or maybe not? Because we're not supposed to have our name in the paper. But, that was the closeness of this whole community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You never, as a kid, you never wanted to make it to the principal's office. Yeah, that was not a good thing. And you knew it, so you did anything that it took to be out of the principal's office.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite stories with my dad. He was sent to the principal's office at Orange Center School. And he sat there for about a half an hour, and nobody came back because back in the day, the principal was usually teaching also.
Oh, okay.
And so they were busy. So my father just very easily went over, opened the window, climbed out, and went home.
Yeah.
And that was it. So, yeah, it was quite an interesting time.
Yeah.
Wow.
And going through, I'm like disjointed now, I apologize, but
No,
going
that's
through some of the old pictures that we have, other things that were very important, right? No surprise, here's more oxen. So there were oxen everywhere. So, but animals, there are probably 50% of the pictures that we have. It's either family or animals. There's no in between, right? So they took picture of every animal, but you were dependent on them as a dairy, especially horses. They had a love for horses, and I'm sure you can relate to it, Judy, but they relied on them for just about everything. One of the things I do remember as a child, again, the farm, the dairy was gone. We weren't doing dairying, but my grandparents still had 4 horses that they took care of. And before rescuing was sort of a thing like it is now, they rescued horses. And it was, oh my God, it was the craziest gang of animals you'd ever seen. There was a donkey named Sherman who was a celebrity in town. The biggest liability in the world because he bit everybody. And it was just the orneriest animal on the face of the planet. They had another horse that had a bad foot, another horse that was in the rodeo that had bad knees, and then we of course had our pony. But it was like a crazy, crazy group of animals, and my grandparents would raise those and took care of those. But any animal that was sick or anything like that was cared for by my grandparents.
And they all had names.
They all had names, and they all had personalities, and they, we had sorry, I'm going into too much detail. There was a bull
It was a bull.
that liked to sit like a dog, and I remember hearing about this,
Yeah.
and this was on Ripley's Believe It or Not, Sitting Bull. They called the bull Sitting Bull, and it was in Ripley's Believe It or Not, because it was the only one apparently that sat like that in that direction. So again, a lot with animals. Over the years, animals and family are a big deal. What else can I see from this?
I think you brought that out, going back the generations, and how Sundays, yes, they spent a lot of time in church, but you're right. Family was again huge.
Yeah.
Where they would go and just catch up, see what's going on,
Yeah.
whatnot. But the family unit was extremely strong back then.
You're right. I actually wrote it in my notes, but I didn't cover it. It surprises me when I think back. The family reunions that we had were huge, and we would often have those at the farm. And it probably wasn't, but it felt like hundreds of people at a time that would, and it was July 4th was a big event. And the family would gather at the farm and celebrate. But I'm amazed at how they kept in touch with each other without email, without text, without cell phones. They knew what was going on, and they were very close. Even though my grandmother's family was from Deep River, Connecticut, she still was very tied with her brothers and sisters from that area. and my grandfather with his family, mostly surrounding here. But they kept in touch with each other, and they did a lot together as family. Judy, you probably mentioned it in your interview, but one of the memories that my grandfather would share with us was a canoe trip that he took in his teens, I believe it was. So it would have
1915.
Yeah. So he would have been probably 19 or 20 at the time. And a bunch of guys from Orange, family, and just friends within the town of Orange, I think went up to the Canadian border with canoes in the Connecticut River, and they canoed down the Connecticut River, I think all the way to Long Island
They
Sound.
came all the way back to Milford.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the way.
Which when I think about that, that was a fun trip, and I'm sure they got into trouble along the way somehow. The way that he would smile and telling the story, I'm sure that they'd got in trouble to some extent. But they would do things like that and hang out together. One funny story I have, I always laughed at this. I'm not sure if it ties in with the town of Orange, but it was always funny to me. And it made me think how hard they had to work back then. And I mentioned the working every day, milking cows twice a week, and it was just, it was probably a little monotonous at times, but very, very hard work. So they do the dairy their whole life, and then they decide to, hey, we're going to sell the cows and we're going to stop. My grandparents had 2 daughters, no sons, and so there wasn't a son to kind of take over the farm. And so they went into retirement mode, which, like I said before, it meant that they just cut thousands of bales of hay a year. Not what most people would consider retirement, but for them it was, and it was somewhat probably relaxing versus what they were used to. And I'm not sure if I'll get the story right here, but like the saying goes, I won't let the facts get in the way of a good story here. My grandparents decide to go on vacation after they have retired, right? And you could see from all the pictures here, they have a love of horses. And a big event for them was watching the Kentucky Derby, right? Huge. They enjoyed watching horse racing. They were very into raising horses and appreciated everything that went on. So they're going on their first real vacation ever, other than a Sunday afternoon. And they decide that they are going to go visit this, I'm not sure which one it was, but a Triple Crown winner winner of the Kentucky Derby. They're going to go out to Kentucky and visit this horse, right? So they pack their stuff in the Buick Riviera, I believe it was, and they drive to Kentucky. And my mother saw them go and have a great time, and a little nervous that they're going out on a vacation on their own in probably their late 60s, early 70s, whatever it was. They were either back the next day or the day after that. They didn't know how to vacation. They drove straight out to Kentucky, visited the horse, got back in the car. They might have stayed overnight, as the story goes, and drove straight back. And my mother was like, "What are you doing here?" They did not know how to relax. They didn't know what to do.
And
so
you
that
can't leave the farm. That's
you
one
can't
thing.
leave it.
That's
Yeah.
just inbred. You just, something needs to be fixed
Yeah.
or done. You can't walk away from it.
Right.
Oh, that is beautiful.
So it's funny. They had to be trained on how to vacation and relax in their, like I said, in their late 60s, early 70s. But that was probably the norm at that time. That's what you did as a farmer.
That's good.
What made them decide to stop being a dairy farm? Because I know you had mentioned that. Was there something that prompted that decision?
I think a couple things may have prompted that. One is there was nobody to really pass it and take it on over. So it was the first generation where there wasn't a son to really kind of walk in and take over. So that was part of it. My father and my uncle were not farmers. They helped out on the farm, but neither one took it over. So that was part of the decision was, okay, where does this go to? And the other part that drove it was we had, and I might be making this up a little bit, but we had a barn that burned down. And I think it was the 50s. And it was hit by lightning and it burned. And a lot of the animals died as part of that fire. And I think that drove part of the decision as well. It was kind of it was a rough time for my grandparents. And as the story goes, it was a bad thunderstorm, lightning, the phones were down. So they had to leave the farm and drive to the fire department to tell them the barn's on fire. And you could always tell that was sort of like a rough event that really drove some of his decision making after that point. So that may have been part of it also that spurred that. What they did do, interestingly enough, and this is not really tied in, but I'll go there. We had owned the original Treat Farm where we farm currently. There was a farm to the south of ours that it was a gentleman's farm, and I can't remember the name of it now.
Fairley Farm?
It wasn't
Lee?
Fairley. I think it might have been Wilson H. Lee.
He was the one who owned Fairley.
We didn't
Okay.
get that scroll out. Wait, we have that in there. Should we pull that out? Would you recognize it if you looked at the list of farms? You might be
Yeah.
able to look.
Yes.
Here, let me pull that out.
It was known as Halen Farm,
Oh, Halen, okay.
and it was a gentleman farm by a very wealthy individual. I don't know if it was Lee or potentially a Stoddard. Okay, it was originally owned by Alfred Treat, and then it went to a Stoddard, that's the name I was looking for, to Wilson H. Lee, and then my grandfather purchased it back from them.
Okay.
And thank you, that was helpful. But it was,
2 points.
yeah, so this always made me laugh. Back in the day, if you were wealthy, right? So now in today's day and age, if you're wealthy, you put a spacecraft up and fly people around in space, right? That's what you do when you're Jeff Bezos or anybody else who has $1 billion. But back in the day, you bought a farm and you raised show cattle or whatever you could, and that was where the wealthy gentlemen would spend their money. And so that's, I believe, what Halen Farm was. And it's a beautiful farm, beautiful barn, red barn on Old Tavern Road. You probably all know where that is. It's like a cathedral. It's amazing. But that was a gentleman farm. And my grandfather bought that when he put it up for sale. And that was a big deal for him. Even when he was 80, restoring, maintaining that barn, and again, maintaining the history that went with it was huge. That barn had originally burned down as well. Lightning, so a lot of lightning strikes. So this is why we have lightning rods everywhere now, is because they hit and you had dry hay and it would burn down. And apparently that's what happened to this barn. And again, many animals died in this. And so that barn was rebuilt where it is right now. And it's interesting, if you look at that, the basement, it's built into the hill, so you kind of look at part of the basement. It's like a fortress, and it was designed so if a barn ever burned down, all the animals would be safe in it.
Oh, wow.
And so it was kind of neat, but that was sort of a neat farm next to ours, and my cousins currently own that. The Gagel and Knight families own that farm now.
But it's true, that's what they would do. I think in most of the people that we have been talking to, you acquire land, you get more, you increase your farm, you know, do more produce on it or whatnot. But that did seem to be the pattern, more so than the reverse, where, you know, you cut back. But back
Right.
in the day, they were looking for more land to
They were
just
trying
increase
to
that
expand
size.
production, right?
And it's also interesting how with the different circumstances that you were presented with and like the different, you know, situations along the way, you learned how to make those improvements that you needed for today.
Yeah.
To keep everything going, so
Yep.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've had to change direction in what we do. So it's much different. You know, we embrace the history of it, but we've changed quite a bit to be relevant in today's day and age. So it's probably good, don't share this with Walt Heine, but it's probably good that we're not a dairy farm, because that's a tough living right now, tough. We've been able to do different things on the farm with cut your own Christmas trees, and we do a lot of produce, and even a corn maze right now that is, they wouldn't have even thought about that 100 years ago in these pictures. They would have been like, what? People get lost in a cornfield and that's cool and you can charge them money for that? They wouldn't have even considered that. But we've had to change over the years since then to sort of keep up and be relevant and do what we do, so.
And that just goes to show you with that resourcefulness that you gain from the experience of being in agriculture. You
Yeah.
have to be resourceful like that and to be able
Correct.
to do that. So.
Yeah, yep,
That's true.
you're right.
Yeah, well put, Lauren. That's true.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say, I just have one more question. Maybe we can end it on kind of, we've been jumping back and forth between past and future, but I thought maybe we can end it on a future related question. Is there anything that you took away from your childhood, like a lesson or piece of advice from your grandparents that you want to pass to future generations?
That's a good question. Give me a second here to gather my thoughts. There's quite a bit. There's quite a few. One is never give up on something. Like always work through it. Find the solution yourself, and don't count on others. Figure it out on your own is one of them. And that sounds a little blunt, but it's kind of a good lesson. And I, teach my kids, learn about it, research it, figure out how to do things. That was one big lesson. Hard work is, you can never replace hard work. So if you're motivated and you put the time in and put the work in, you'll be successful in doing that. And that applies to farming, it applies to athletics, it applies to just about anything in life. And that was a big thing that they taught me that I look to transfer to my children as well. Nothing can replace that. I talked a lot about education, and my grandparents and parents, although they were farmers, always stressed education. That was a very important thing, and that took precedence over just about everything. And I do that to a fault these days to my children as well. We take that very seriously. Having fun is important, and enjoying what you do, taking that time out to relax, even though they didn't always do it, they made sure that we had that opportunity. And what else did they instilled a lot upon us. That would, and it's funny because you hear this a lot, it's funny. I've become my parents, I've become my grandparents with my kids. Stuff that I swore I would never do, I'm making them do now, and doing some of the same things. History is big. I make them learn history so they have an appreciation for how things are today and what's available to them. We do that a lot to say, and I did it just the other day with my kids. Okay, this is what shoveling snow looks like. As simple as that seems, right? We have a snowblower, and I appreciate the snowblower because I used to do it by hand, and they did it the other day by hand, and now we get it, type thing, and that applies all over the place.
And I think the other thing too is family. You talked a lot
Yeah.
about that.
Yep.
And I think that is
Yeah.
something that a lot of us have learned,
Yes.
and really strive to maintain that when you stop and think about the reunions that we had a long time ago.
Yep.
Just that concept of family's important.
Correct. Yeah, that's always a big deal. So yeah, we still do quite a bit with the families and try to keep up with each other as much. So.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. It's been really interesting hearing
Thanks.
about like all your connections and what your takeaways from your childhood here was like. It's been all super awesome. Like we've gotten a lot of great stuff in this.
Okay, good.
That was good. Good. Perfect.
You sure?
Yes.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I
No.
feel so.
I'm sure I missed a lot, but
No. You know what? It's not a test.
yeah.
you know, the best thing is just think 100 years from now, someone's gonna be looking at this. Really, and I think that's what people don't understand,
Yeah.
how neat this is,
Yeah,
you know, to be able to have that and,
Right.
You know, go back and see someone move, talk
Right.
and whatnot, and you really get to know.
I wish, the technology didn't exist, but I wish that they documented more like this 100, when it was the 100th anniversary, because
They didn't have time.
they didn't have time, they didn't have the
No, they
technology.
didn't have technology, and they were busy. They had to go get that crop in, or the horses had to be fed, and
Right, but they were 70 years from the start. They were born 70 years after the start of there was still that connection, right? They were still talking to people. My grandparents talked to veterans of the Civil War.
isn't that something?
When you think about like that, they had that connection
Wow.
to that. So it would have been neat to.
That would-
I appreciate that generation because they were exposed to so much, I guess. So
That would have been incredible.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
they talked about a tower that was on the corner of Tyler City and Racebrook Road.
Oh yeah, the
and it
World
was
War
used to
II.
watch.
oh yes. So right, yeah, my grandfather participated
We
in
can't
that.
find any pictures of a tower.
I don't think
though.
I have a
I'm
picture.
gonna have to go online and just Google.
They-
just come up with a generic one. But so your grandfather was part of that?
Yeah, so from my understanding, and it was kind of a voluntary corps during one of the wars,
The World
and
War
they
II, I
they
think it was.
yeah, and they were looking for, I believe, Japanese submarines on the coast.
And the
and
coast,
planes.
And they were also looking for the planes.
Yeah,
And they had decks of cards that they studied what an underbelly of the plane would look like.
oh okay.
So they could, report in, it was a blah, blah, blah plane.
I know he
Yeah.
participated in that, and I heard stories about that, not to that much detail, but then they would take shifts and watch that. So
Interesting.
let's
Really?
see what was going on.
Who would think? When we first heard about it in one of our interviews, we were like, really?
Yeah.
In Orange, Connecticut, you were concerned about, warplanes coming over, but
It's surprising. It's surprising how much of the coast you can see from Orange and from the barn that I was talking about, Halen Barn. If you open the door on the second floor, you can see Long Island Sound.
there you go.
And when they were mapping the coast, probably early 80s, mid 80s, they built a tower on the farm over there, and they had towers all along the coastline, and so they could
The coordinates or
effectively map the coast. And so it's higher than you think in a way, and it's a pretty good viewpoint from where it is.
whatever. Cool.
So yeah, because I wasn't sure, and I heard stories of that back then, that they would watch the coast and watch for planes.
Oh, gosh. Interesting times.
Yeah,
Interesting.
now it's not really necessary because.
No, you have radar, you have the technology that's doing it for you, and the military. But
Right.
again, that's an example of you did what it took.
You were resourceful, you used what you had.
Right.
Things remote, like the people that are watching over that stuff could be anywhere in the country,
Correct.
Right.
but
it's
it
true.
really depended on people participating locally, and
Right.
Right.
it's just different.
And again, they had to take time from work and stuff like that and go out and be part of that team, so.
Yeah. And everyone felt like they were contributing. Like nowadays, it's people that aren't in the military. Maybe there's no connection to,
Yeah.
what's going on
Right.
in that realm. But back then, it seems like
Yeah.
it affected everyone.
It did. We have, and I've been doing a lot of research. I told Judy about this, but doing a lot of research on the Civil War, because we have a relative that was in the Civil War, and wrote letters back every week to his mother in Orange, telling him where he was, what he was doing, and it's a great history of the Civil War through his eyes. And it's interesting, and I laugh about it because he mustered in New Haven and trained in Washington, D.C., and then went down into the South. And I laugh because he was at all what we consider vacation spots now. So Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, Savannah, St. Augustine, Florida, they were all forts down there. And I'm like, he had it easy during the Civil War. He was just visiting beaches and hanging out and stuff like that. But it's a really cool history through his viewpoint back then. But towards the end of the war, it got a little rougher. They marched on Richmond, so, and he's buried in the cemetery here. So, yeah, they did all kinds of stuff. And when you look at the volunteers for that war in Connecticut, you recognize a lot of the names, and that was your duty. It wasn't an option. It was you're going type thing. And I get the same impression from the World Wars and even the Revolutionary War. It's like this is what you signed up for.
Exactly.
And the Revolutionary War, it's funny when I look at. Sorry, now you got me going. I'm like a diesel. I'm not going to stop. I apologize. But when I looked at the history of the Revolutionary War and prior to that, so when we settled here, all right, this is no surprise to you, right? A lot of loyalty to the King of England. He deeded land.
Tories.
Right, and like I mentioned, he gave land based because of surveying and whatever. So that's a lot of the property that we have was from land grants. And then they turned on. And they fought on the American side in the Revolutionary War. So it's funny how in what less than 150 years things changed dramatically. And we all read about that in history books. But when you see it in your history, it's kind of neat.
It's true. It's true. Good job.
It's amazing that we have that history too, like that you have those letters and you can kind of
Yeah.
look back at
Yeah.
that, reference that,
And they
the first-hand account.
right.
Amazing.
And like I was joking around before, they saved everything, which is helpful because we have
Right.
pictures, we have documents, and we have
Yep.
things like that. And if you appreciate it,
Bill of
it's a
sale.
great gift from them. On the flip side, they literally saved everything. So I have every Tupperware container since the beginning of time and stuff like that. They kept every nail. Nothing got thrown out.
I wish we could have done this interview at your house, so we could have done like the whole like
You're
lot of your Tupperware collection.
You're welcome to go. I remember literally once, am I still on camera? This is bad that I'm admitting to this. I remember, in a sense, when I started doing the farm, I was still in my teens, like helping out more. And my grandparents were older. They were kind of done, and I remember opening the garage door and literally it was filled with like Dole Whip containers and everything else you can imagine. And I'm like, what am I going to do with all this? And I have spent my life throwing out stuff that they saved, and I feel guilty about every little thing. They literally saved every nail, and they would find a use for everything. There'd be wood screws and equipment.
In jars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't go to, there was no Home Depot, there was no, I mean, I'm stating the obvious, right? There wasn't that accessibility, so you made do with what you had, and it was like,
Definitely.
But-
And it was also this is something you were saying before made me think of Bob Isa's interview with he was saying a lesson that he had learned from someone in the town was that I think it was Ralph
Everyone
Cilantro.
is in a need.
Yeah, he was like, everyone is in a need, and I just think that that theme has been in this like what discussion that we've been having with bringing up the idea of resourcefulness and
yeah.
trying to make the most of what you have. So
Right.
that's really
So
that's
true.
an important
No,
message.
they did that. They recycled before it was as cool as it is today. I mean, they lived it.
It's true. It's true.
Even down to newspapers were used in the garden
Yeah,
as
composting,
mulch.
Yeah, right.
And they did that. Hand-me-downs, everything like that. I'm jumping around on you.
No, this is
We have the mall, we have stores, we have Amazon. My parents' generation, and I heard stories about this, they would travel to Hartford to go clothes shopping.
right.
New Haven was an option, but a lot of times they would.
G-Fox.
G-Fox was the huge
in
place
Hartford,
that they
sure.
would go to do all their shopping. And again, they would meet family there
Yeah.
and make and it was an event, yeah, to do that. So, and meet up with people.
Right.
I do have one quote I'm going to steal. I found it, one of my sisters, I'm not sure which sister, let's see if I find it here. And it was from my grandmother, Addie Treat, who I may have mentioned before, she grew up in Chester Deep River area. Her last maiden name was Butler. And they did some farming there where she was, but not to the extent that it existed in Orange and my grandfather. So a quote that she had was, "No wonder I like to live on a farm. It really seems as if one could be nearer to God in the country than in a city. One can see more of nature's work, God's work. Someday I hope to live on a farm again, and I hope that time is not far away." So just kind of interesting stuff. Cut that out because I'm like crying as I read it.
Oh, isn't that beautiful? And when do you think she said that? Do you think she said that when she was, before she married?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
she got her wish.
Yep.
But we've been hearing quite a few of the opposite, including like Mary Ellen Vespucci, and talking about how they were such city girls
Okay.
coming in, and all of a sudden they're on a farm, and as they all said, they learned how to be a farmer.
Yep.
And they learned it pretty quick, because
Yeah.
there was always something to do. But we've heard that from a couple of the wives who
Yeah.
come from city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got to cut that part out because I didn't make it through.
Aw.